Welcome back to my channel. Hope you are having a great day. And please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more. Few inventions have shaped human history as profoundly as the gun. It has defended nations, overthrown empires, fueled revolutions, and caused unimaginable tragedy. But after nearly 1,000 years, why hasn't humanity abandoned firearms? There are inventions that make life easier: the wheel, the printing press, the telephone. And then there are inventions that change the course of human history. The gun is one of them. From crude weapons made from bamboo and iron, to muskets carried by European armies, to revolvers, rifles, and machine guns, firearms transformed the way human beings fought, defended themselves, conquered territory, and built nations. But the gun created a paradox. It could place enormous power in the hands of an ordinary person, and that power could be used to protect or to destroy. So how did we get here? Why were guns invented? How did they become so powerful? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, have guns become a necessary evil? For most of human history, war was brutally personal. If you wanted to kill your enemy, you generally had to get close enough to strike him. Swords, spears, axes, bows, crossbows. These weapons had existed for centuries, and some were remarkably sophisticated. But there was a problem. Many of the most effective weapons required considerable skill. A powerful bow could take years to master. A sword required training. A professional warrior could spend most of his life learning how to fight. Then something arrived that would begin to change that equation. Gunpowder. The story of the gun begins not in Europe, but in China. More than 1,000 years ago, Chinese experimenters discovered a remarkable mixture of ingredients that could burn explosively: gunpowder. At first, its uses were not limited to weapons. It was used in fireworks, signals, and military devices. But eventually, people began asking a dangerous question. What happens if you put gunpowder inside a tube and use the explosion to launch a projectile? The answer would change warfare forever. The earliest firearms were primitive. They were essentially metal or bamboo tubes containing gunpowder and a projectile. They were difficult to aim. They were dangerous to operate, and they were slow to reload. But they possessed one extraordinary advantage. They could unleash enormous force. Early firearms gradually spread across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And as the technology improved, so did the weapons. The hand cannon eventually gave way to more sophisticated firearms. Then came the matchlock. For the first time, soldiers could carry a firearm that was easier to operate, and armies began to change. By the early modern period, firearms had become an increasingly important part of warfare. The musket was not particularly accurate, but accuracy was not always the point. Armies discovered that hundreds of soldiers firing together could produce devastating results. War became less about individual warriors and more about organized formations, discipline, training, logistics, mass production. The gun was no longer simply a weapon, it was becoming an institution. As firearms improved, they became deeply connected to the rise and expansion of states and empires. European powers carried firearms across oceans. Guns became part of military campaigns, colonial expansion, and resistance movements. But it is important to understand something. Firearms did not conquer the world by themselves. Disease, political alliances, economic power, naval technology, organization, and many other factors played enormous roles. Still, firearms gave states another powerful instrument, the ability to project violence over greater distances. And that ability would have consequences across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Then, during the 18th and 19th centuries, firearms began changing rapidly. The flintlock improved reliability. The percussion cap made ignition more dependable. Then came the revolver, a firearm that could hold multiple rounds and fire repeatedly without the shooter having to reload after every shot. Manufacturing technology was also transforming the industry. Machines could produce weapons in greater numbers. And suddenly, guns were becoming more accessible. The age of mass-produced firearms had arrived. Then came one of the most consequential developments in the history of firearms, the machine gun. Instead of firing one shot, then stopping to reload, a machine gun could deliver sustained fire. The battlefield would never be the same again. During the First World War, industrial technology met industrial warfare. Millions of soldiers were placed on battlefields where machines could kill at unprecedented speed. The romantic image of warfare disappeared. War had become industrialized. The 20th century accelerated the development of firearms even further: semi-automatic pistols, submachine guns, bolt-action rifles, semi-automatic rifles, and eventually assault rifles. Firearms became lighter, faster, and more reliable. But another transformation was taking place. The gun was no longer exclusively a military tool. It had become part of civilian life in many societies. Police carried firearms. Hunters carried firearms. Sportsmen carried firearms. And ordinary citizens in some countries acquired firearms for personal protection. The debate over guns was becoming more than a military question. It was becoming a social and political one. For supporters of firearms, the argument is straightforward. A gun can provide a means of protection. Police may use firearms to confront dangerous criminals. Soldiers may use them to defend their country. Hunters use firearms as tools. Competitive shooters use them as sporting equipment. And some civilians believe that owning a firearm gives them the ability to protect themselves and their families. From this perspective, the gun is not inherently evil. It is a tool, and the morality lies in how that tool is used. But there is another side. Firearms can turn moments of anger into irreversible tragedies. They can be used in murders, robberies, terrorist attacks, civil wars, and mass violence. The very characteristic that makes a gun useful for defense, its ability to project lethal force quickly, also makes it extraordinarily dangerous when misused. This is the paradox at the heart of the gun debate. The same capability that can protect a life can also end one. Perhaps the answer is not as simple as yes or no. Calling the gun a necessary evil assumes that the world must choose between two uncomfortable realities: a world where firearms exist and a world where they do not. But history rarely gives humanity such simple choices. Different societies have reached different conclusions. Some place enormous emphasis on civilian gun ownership. Others impose much stricter controls. Some societies have high levels of firearm ownership, but relatively different patterns of violence. Others have experienced devastating conflicts fueled by weapons. The lesson of history may therefore be less about the gun itself and more about the societies surrounding it, its laws, its institutions, its culture, its conflicts, and the responsibility of the people who control the weapon. Today, firearms continue to evolve, but the future of warfare may not belong entirely to the traditional gun. Drones, robotics, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, cyber warfare. Technology is once again changing the battlefield. And that raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the greatest lesson of firearm history is not that weapons become more powerful. It is that human beings continually find new ways to project power. The weapon changes. The question remains the same. Who controls it? And who is responsible for what happens when it is used? For more than 1,000 years, the history of firearms has followed the history of humanity. We invented them to project force. We improved them to make them more reliable. We manufactured them on an industrial scale. We used them to defend nations. We used them to conquer nations. We used them to commit terrible crimes. And we used them to protect lives. The gun itself has no morality. It is an instrument. But history reminds us that instruments can shape the people who use them, just as much as people shape the instruments they create. So perhaps the real question is not, are guns a necessary evil? Perhaps the real question is, what kind of society needs them? And what kind of society is capable of controlling them? Because the history of the gun is ultimately not just the history of a weapon, it is the history of human power and our struggle to decide what to do with it. The history of guns is ultimately the history of humanity itself, a story of innovation, survival, conflict, and responsibility. The same invention that has protected lives has also taken countless others. Whether firearms remain a necessary evil or become a relic of the past will depend not only on technology, but on the choices societies make. Please like, share, and subscribe.